if I were to teach a course on personality, one of the required readings would be a work of Dostoevsky, whether it be Crime and Punishment or perhaps the Brothers Karamazov, and I'm still going to read the rest of his works. So we determined which other ones I would recommend. Dostoevsky's characters are vessels for ideas, but also very poignant persons in and of themselves. His books are battlefields of ideas. The battlefield of ideas that plays out across the narrative of somebody's life. In this video, we're going to talk about Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, one of the greatest literary works of all time. I will get into spoilers after a few minutes, more specifically, like heavy things that happen in the book. So if you want to avoid those, I'll give you a quick warning before I really unload what happens in the book so that you have the opportunity, if you haven't, to go read it. Other than that, the goal in this book is to take my expertise as somebody with a PhD in psychology, and one of my expertise is the personality and the psyche and how it interfaces with meaning and connection and growth, and comment on how Dostoevsky masterfully shows us the deeper themes of personality psychology that you will not find in your everyday textbook on psychology. I mean, he has a rare insight here, and I comment on that in depth. So at first, I give you a primer of my background so you can understand some of the philosophical and intellectual tools that I apply to reading Dostoevsky. I hope you enjoy. And if you're new here, my name is Dr. Ryan Holsapple. So let's talk about Crime and Punishment. The character Raskolnikov is particularly interesting to me as someone who studies personality. One of my areas of expertise in psychology is what you could call psychic multiplicity, or the personality structure, or parts work. There are different ways to think about it, but in essence, I have studied for years the way in which the psyche, the personality, is constituted of various motivations, urges, traits, dispositions, driving forces, energies. These are all the multiple factors that make up the wholeness of who we are. So in a strange way, I study Mariology, which is to say the part-whole relationship of the psyche, of the personality. After all, we are a whole human being, which is irreducible to any of its parts. We are stitched together in such a way that you cannot isolate a part of the personality and act as if it is fully autonomous when it is connected and interdependent with the rest of the whole. Yet we can also study the contours and the specific movements and styles of consciousness that run through particular personality traits of the psyche. For example, if you have a temperament towards anger, you have a stronger disposition genetically towards anger that has been reinforced through life experiences. You can study that trait as a semi-autonomous, semi-independent will of its own. So what that means is it might have an agenda that other parts of you don't hold, and it might contradict other parts of you. So if you are having an argument with your spouse and the angry part of you wants to punish her or him and be right, but the loving parts of you would rather be in harmony and could care less about the prideful, self-defensive project of being right, then you have what's called in psychology an intrapsychic conflict, an internal conflict. Now, many of us are very familiar with this. I mean, every day we have internal conflicts. After all, anytime we have an emotion or a predicament or something that bothers us, an issue by definition suggests there is more than one part of the psyche at play. There's more than one part of you who is needing or wanting something. After all, if you were just one thing, you had no internal contradictions, no internal diversity, no internal landscape of vantage points by which you can see one point in contradistinction to another. If you didn't have that, then you would never have any issues. Life would be easy. Everything would be single-minded. You would be so focused on only one thing, nothing else would occur to you as mattering, and that is by definition, not human. To be human is to be constituted of various needs, wants, desires. For example, just at a very basic physical level, which overlaps with our psychological levels, the need to eat, the need to procreate, the need to have shelter. I mean, all of these needs are deeply embedded within our being as humans. And when you continue into the more sophisticated layers of psychology, you see that they get even more nuanced and complex, right down to the need to create something, or the desire to create something as an artist, or the desire to have relationship, or the desire to compete, or the desire to be an athlete, or the desire to be a scholar. There are all these different internal matrices of desire and motivation that constitute who we are as a human person. And that's what I study as a personality researcher. So that's where I'm coming from when I read a brilliant author like Dostoevsky, who is, by definition, just a genius of the personality. In fact, if I were to teach a course on personality, one of the required readings would be a work of Dostoevsky, whether it be Crime and Punishment or perhaps the Brothers Karamazov, and I'm still going to read the rest of his works. So we determined which other ones I would recommend. Dostoevsky's characters are vessels for ideas, but also very poignant persons in and of themselves. His books are battlefields of ideas. The battlefield of ideas that plays out across the narrative of somebody's life. And the ideas, in some sense, are sociocultural commentaries on what's happening in their premonitions, in a certain sense. They're about what's happening in the landscape of philosophy and culture and complex geopolitical factors in his time, religious issues, but also they are premonitions. He has an uncanny way of loading into his characters narratives which bespeak of things that haven't yet happened in Russia or in the world. If you read his work and you don't see premonitions of World War I, of World War II, of Stalinist Russia, of the Nazi regime, then you're not paying attention. Dostoevsky, in a very poignant way, is able to forecast, because he's reading into these psychic factors which are lived in the human being, which, after all the decisions that are made by humankind are made by factors of human decisions that are driven by these personality traits that I have just now articulated, but also these underlying ideological structures which can somewhat possess the human person or possess groups of people, and that also have a spiritual reality behind them. And the way that he articulates the juxtaposition of these different impulses and ideas of his characters is nothing less than brilliant and very diagnostic for what it is to be a human being and what issues that we have to face, whether or not we recognize it explicitly. To make it a little more concrete, when you take a character like Raskolnikov, who is living in squalor, who clearly has a complex personality. At one point, Razumikin, his friend, actually articulates his complex personality about halfway through the book. And what Razumikin says is that Raskolnikov is essentially a bundle of contradictions. He's a loving person, but would rather do something very mean than to be vulnerable and seen in his love. He is very witty, but he hesitates to use his wit and isolates and stays pent up, and he's aloof, he's arrogant, prideful, and also a very kind person who wants to do things. Yet this wants to do nice things for other people. There's a part of the book where he finds a 14-year-old or a young girl, a teenager, drunk on the street who had obviously been abused by another person, a man who had gotten her drunk and then set her back out on the street. and he was very concerned that somebody else would come snatch her up or take advantage of her, another man. And so he urgently tries to make sure that she gets to the next place that she needs to go safely and is not exposed, is not vulnerable to abuse. Now, this is a very different person than the Raskolnikov who, and if you haven't read the books, I'm just going to tell you right now, spoiler alert, that this is going to, from now on, include facts of the books that you might want to read on your own before hearing them from me. But you've been warned, so here I go. So he eventually murders someone, right? So the same person who is a murderer is also a very charitable, loving human being. That's what it is to be human. That's why I study the personality at the level of analysis I do, because the truth is that we are complex. We are not just one thing. And yes, we are also whole. We're not just a fragmentation of parts either. But when those parts within us are so strongly insistent on meeting their own agenda, even at the expense of the whole, that's what you could call a dysfunctional way of living. And it flies in the face of love, and it flies in the face of following Christ, right? Because you are creating an idol out of a certain desire within yourself. And so while Raskolnikov is clearly a loving person, there's this scene where he's, like I said, trying to help this girl, and he even gives the police officer money to make sure that she gets to where she needs to go, and he has really no money to give. He just gives what he has, which is what he needs to just survive and eat, and even that he gives away. That's a loving human being. And yet, as the police officer takes the money and is like, okay, yeah, I'll make sure to get her where she needs to go, he snaps into another part of himself a few moments later and shouts back at the officer and says, "What is it to you where she goes? Why do you care so much?" In essence, this nihilistic, murderous, resentful part of Raskolnikov that is unchecked, he takes over and contradicts the part of him that was trying to help and trying to love this girl and make sure that she is safe. And the officer looked at him like he had absolutely lost his mind, because Raskolnikov's issue is essentially an issue of continuous fragmentation throughout the book. His theory, because he's a very intelligent person, his theory is that, not unlike Nietzsche, everything is permissible to him who is bright enough and willing to take the power to achieve what it is that they want to do, and that they should not be condemned by their own conscience for being greater than other men. And so that a great man should be able to permit himself to commit unspeakable crimes because those crimes are arbitrary to a great man. After all, he uses a character like a Napoleon. After all, a Napoleon surely has committed human atrocities, but it is for the greater good of humankind. So Raskolnikov has this self-justifying intellect that says, and he had published an article on this as a bright young man, that anything is permissible to him who is great, and that he might have to step over many dead bodies to get to where he needs to go to serve the greater good of humanity. But because he is a unique, one-of-a-kind human being, he has the right to commit this crime. He has the right to do what he has to do, and that while he might be transgressing an arbitrary social boundary, within his own soul, he will not condemn himself. Now, right away, you have his arrogance laid out in full form there, that there are great men and there are lesser men, and he is one of the great men. Therefore, anything is permissible. Therefore, if he were to commit a murder and steal money from this pawnbroker woman who he ends up killing, this old lady, that is fine, because he needed the money so that he could achieve his education. After all, he didn't deserve to be living in squalor. Somebody as great as himself should have better things in life than what he was given. So he has this entitlement. He has this underlying resentment, right? And he isolates and becomes self-referential, and he puts himself in a situation where he's essentially feeding this desire, this murderous desire, and it leads to the actual act. And in some sense, it reminds me of what the fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the saints of the church teach, which is that if a thought enters into the psyche and we aren't vigilant to catch it and to stop it or to not engage it, it will build itself in our head. It'll build itself up. And eventually, as that thought continues unchecked, it'll turn into behavior. It'll turn into a continual living out of a passion, of a sinful way of being, a fragmented way of being. And you can see, in a sense, how he did not mount a sufficient resistance against his own detrimental agendas. While he had these loving parts of him that surely were real, the loving son that wanted his mother to be taken care of and his sister to be taken care of, that loving disposition did not outweigh the resentful, murderous disposition. And in fact, the murderous disposition even commandeers the loving part of him for the sake of, well, I have to kill these people, this person, so that I can care for my mother. So there's these contorted self-justifying actions that are completely nonsensical from an ethical point of view, but make sense to Raskolnikov because he is possessed by a part of his personality that is completely unwilling to humble itself. There's something in his conscience that knows what he did violated something deep within himself, that he could not simply live out this theory that he made, that his internal need to live a life oriented towards God, oriented towards the good, oriented towards love, was actually more important than this theory, which I'll show you how it breaks down in a later dream he has. He's completely unbalanced. His ability to shrewdly operate is inhibited by his disrupted limbic system, his disrupted emotional and psychological life. He cannot live in the world he's created. He's dealing with illness, which is induced by these horrible psychological states that he's in and this horrible act that he's done. And he's still very smart and calculated, but he cannot outwit the prosecutor, the detective, who came across the article that he had written and put the pieces together and started having suspicions about Raskolnikov. And he utterly outmaneuvers Raskolnikov in the encounters that they have together. He has Raskolnikov on his heels. He is much more in control. He is much more, interestingly, the detective is more integrated in his ability to take command over these different psychic impulses. And what I mean by that is that the detective is actually is able to shift between game theory and altruism. And he does so in a brilliant way. And what I mean is that the game theory is, okay, I know this guy, Raskolnikov, did it. I know he's guilty, but I'm going to keep him guessing. And so I'm going to tease that I know, but then act very surprised when he suggests that I'm accusing him. I'm going to go on these soliloquies, which are intellectual red herrings, so to speak, to keep Raskolnikov frustrated and always on edge. And then I'm going to shift into, after just when Raskolnikov thinks that I'm trying to corner him, rightly so, I'm going to show him that I actually care about him as a human being. See, he breaks through the game theory, Porfiry, excuse me about butchering the name, the detective. He breaks through the game theory and shows Raskolnikov, look, I know you did it, but I really care about you as a human being, and I want your well-being. And your well-being actually means that you should confess, because you can't live in the world you've created. And yet, from the game theory perspective, look, I am a detective, and my job is to bust you. My job is to catch the criminal. Now, I'm also a human being, and my job is to care about you. You see, Dostoevsky is brilliant with the personality multiplicity. I suggest all of you who haven't studied personality in detail, pay attention to your own life, and you will notice these different movements, urges, interpretive frames, styles of consciousness, styles of interaction, always oscillating within you. It's just that we don't stop and pay attention, but we're always faced with the multiplicity within us. And the more integrated we are, the more that we can, just like the detective shows a mastery over this, the more that we can intentionally shift in between these different motivating forces in a way that serves a greater purpose. But the more disintegrated that we are, the more that we are beholden to the multiple fragmented parts of the psyche, which are pulling us in whichever direction they please, and doing so without a higher ordering principle. And that's where Raskolnikov is. Whereas the detective, it has much more of a mastery and a fluidity over his own psychology. And that's what allows him to outmaneuver him. Even though Raskolnikov may very well be the more intelligent person, he does not have mastery over his intelligence. And that is his downfall. He does not have mastery over his inner fragmentation. So he eventually realizes that the only option is for him to confess, although he doesn't quite admit that it's his conscience. He more plays it off like he's doing what he has to do in order to pick the lesser of evils. Well, I'll get a reduced sentence because I decided to confess when I didn't necessarily have to, and it's better than killing myself. And I can't deal with running away. He tries to justify it as if it's just another selfish thing he's doing. But in the end, it's quite clear to me that Raskolnikov did have an awakening of conscience. He did realize that his theory was wrong, and he disproved his own theory. And by the end, in the epilogue, he is willing to vulnerably open his heart and risk loving Sonia, who is the love interest throughout the book, who cares about him deeply. As she visits him in prison, he decides to courageously open and be tender enough to say, I want to be with you. And he would not have been able to do that had he remained in the same state of consciousness he was in post-murder through the illness. This was a movement of courage and truth within Raskolnikov. Now, ultimately, although he never explicitly rejects his own theory, he internally rejects his own theory through a dream. And this dream is very poignant because it symbolically shows the dismantling philosophically of the theory. I will read it to you now. Raskolnikov lay ill in the hospital during all the latter part of Lent and Eastertide. Whilst returning to health, he called to mind the dreams which he had during the period of delirium. The whole world was desolated by an unknown and terrible plague, which was coming from the interior of Asia, spreading over all countries. All perished except a few elect. Parasites of a new character, microscopical beings, fixed their home in the human body. But these animalculae were breathing creatures imbued with intellect and will. Persons affected became immediately mad, but strange to say, the stricken were, at the same time, imbued with a strong sense of their own good judgment. Never did they believe themselves so strongly endowed with wisdom and intellectual vigor or scientific conclusions and moral perceptions so correct as now. Whole villages and towns, the entire population became tainted and lost their reason. They were incapable of understanding one another, because each believed himself the sole possessor of truth, and looking upon his unenlightened neighbors, beat his breast, threw up his arms, and wept. They could not agree upon any point, knew not what to consider evil, what to consider good, and they fell upon one another in anger and killed, and they formed great armies, but once in motion, they tore each other to pieces. In the towns, the alarm was great. Meetings were called, but For what and by whom, no one knew. The communist trade was abandoned because everyone had his own idea to the mode of pursuing it, but no two agreed. Agriculture was also abandoned. People gathered together in crowds, agreed upon a common action, swearing never to abandon one another, then immediately rushed into something else, forgot their agreement, and ended rushing upon and murdering each other. Incendiarism was rife everywhere, and famine set in. Everything perished. The pestilence raged more and more. Of the whole world, only a few remained. These were the pure and the elect, predestined to found a new race, to inaugurate the new life, and to purify the earth. But the chosen were not recognized. No one knew their voices or heard their words. So, this dream sat poignantly with Raskolnikov, and I want to tell you why it relates to exactly what I'm talking about. Notice in the dream, it is precisely the observation that I alluded to earlier, which is that multiplicity without adherence to a principle of wholeness becomes fragmentation and chaos. And because Raskolnikov's theory is a theory of fragmentation where anything goes without regard or respect to any notion of ethics or wholeness or love or altruism, it is a cancerous theory. And anybody who has briefly acquainted themselves with cancer knows that a cancer cell is a cell that proliferates at the expense of the whole, right? A cancer cell is that cell which does not regulate its own repopulation. And when within our own psyches, if we do not regulate the repopulation of certain urges and keep them in their proper place, they will take over the system like a cancer and lead to behaviors that are detrimental to the whole, that are cancerous to the whole. And that's precisely what happened with Raskolnikov's life. His dream is defeating his own theory. It's showing the natural outcome of his theory, that all these warring factions and the population of individualized microscopic infections that each have their own will and idea, that is precisely this notion of subpersonalities or parts of the psyche that are not regulated, that are not coherent with the rest of the system, that are possessed, so to speak, demonically, that are not willing to repent or are so caught up in their own prideful self-regulated agenda that they're unwilling to serve anything greater than themselves. And that is actually an irrational state because it's not sustainable, because it leads to death, and death is irrational. It's dysfunctional. So his theory leads to dysfunction. That's what the dream shows. The dream shows, it says, Raskolnikov, this is the outcome of your theory. Everyone devours each other. It's everyone for themselves. That's the outcome of your theory. It's a brilliant point that Dostoevsky is making in the Epilogue without saying it explicitly. And so by the end of this book, he's having this dream and his heart's opening up to Sonia. And what that indicates is a more sincere form of repentance, where he's willing to recognize the folly of his ways, to humble himself, and to rebuild his life brick by brick. So this has been an interesting discussion of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, certainly the best author I've ever read. As a psychology PhD, this is one of the most valuable texts that I've read in terms of understanding psychology and elaborating on certain things. It's a book that I will certainly reread probably many times in my life, Crime and Punishment. And like the brothers Karamazov, it is inexhaustible in terms of its themes, which are provoking and insightful for human life. And moreover, he provides a bridge between my life in secular studies, psychology, the human sciences, and the Orthodox Christian faith. And that makes him an even more valuable author to me because he makes the dialogue coherent. And rightly ordered in service towards Christ.